These are the recordings for Chapter 10 on photosynthesis. And I'm sure you know that the cells, plant cells and the cells of algae and some bacteria carry out photosynthesis. Plant cells and algae, the algal cells is how you say that, they carry out photosynthesis in organelles called chloroplast. But basically, photosynthesis involves absorbing sunlight, using the energy from the sunlight energy to convert carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water that the plants take in through their roots. So carbon dioxide and water are the reactants, and then they are converted into food for the plant plus oxygen gas. And the organic molecule, we typically just say glucose, but it can be glucose or any other basically carbohydrate, plus oxygen gas is given off as a byproduct. Now, it's really the exact reverse of cellular respiration. So hopefully this won't take as long because we're just reversing cellular respiration. And there are definitely some other details that are different. But anyway, the definition of photosynthesis: it's the process that converts solar energy or sunlight into chemical energy within chloroplast. And by chemical energy, it means the chemical energy found within glucose molecules. Organisms are divided into types based on how they eat, how they feed, how they get their food. So autotrophs are going to be the ones that make their own food, and they're self-feeders, okay? We also call them producers because they produce the food for the planet. It says almost all plants are photoautotrophs. Well, I don't know a plant that's not a photoautotroph. Even a plant, like I don't know if they mean, when they say almost, I don't know if they mean like Venus flytrap, you know, because it's going to eat insects too. But even a Venus flytrap carries out photosynthesis. So I think it's all plants. I've never heard of a plant that's not, you know, a photoautotroph. But photoautotrophs, it means that. Autotroph means they make their own food. But then every autotroph has to have an energy source to help it make its own food. So photoautotrophs use sunlight as their energy source. Okay? There are some organisms, it's not many, but there are some examples that use chemical energy. So they're called chemoautotrophs. Now, photosynthesis occurs in algae, and it says certain other protists. It's primarily algae and any protozoans that have chloroplast in their cells. And then some prokaryotes, the bacteria called cyanobacteria, are photosynthetic. And here we have some examples of organisms that carry out photosynthesis, so we call them photoautotrophs. We have the fern plant and all the other plants here in the forest. We have cyanobacteria, which is a prokaryote, of course. We have purple sulfur bacteria. We have multicellular algae, and we have, these are euglena, which are unicellular protozoans. They can swim, so they're kind of like an animal, but then they carry out photosynthesis, so they're kind of like a plant. So we always use the kingdom Protista. The protists are like the group that we throw things in that won't fit into other groups. Now, organisms that don't make their own food, organisms that consume their own food, or that consume their food, are heterotrophs. Humans are heterotrophs. And heterotrophs are the consumers of the biosphere. Some consumers are decomposers because they actually just decompose dead organic material or feces. And fossil fuels are formed over hundreds of millions of years by the remains of organisms that died. And almost all heterotrophs depend on photoautotrophs. Either they eat them or they eat other organisms that eat them. So almost all heterotrophs depend on photoautotrophs for food and oxygen gas for breathing. Now, the organelle that carries out photosynthesis is called the chloroplast. And chloroplast, you have to understand a chloroplast really to understand the process of photosynthesis. But we'll start with the area of the plant that carries out photosynthesis. Primarily in plants, photosynthesis occurs in the leaves, but really any part of the plant that's green. So it can even be the stem or anything above the ground, but it's primarily the leaves and the stem to some extent, but it's mostly the leaves. So the chloroplasts are found within the leaf cells in tissue called mesophyll tissue, which is just the middle tissue in a leaf. Mesophyll is in the middle, and then it's surrounded on the top and the bottom of the leaf by epidermal tissue, I think is what it's called. But anyway, it's mesophyll is just in the middle of the leaf, the interior tissue of the leaf, and that is the tissue that the cells are going to contain chloroplast. The cells in the mesophyll tissue have pores called stomata, and those pores allow carbon dioxide to enter and oxygen to exit. And also they allow for water vapor to exit the leaf. And then as far as the water, so carbon dioxide enters the plant through the stomata in the leaf cells. But water enters the plant through veins or vascular tissue from the roots. All right, the parts of the chloroplast are thylakoids, which are disc-like structures that are green, and they form stacks. Thylakoids are the part of the chloroplast where the light reactions of photosynthesis occur. The thylakoids contain the pigment chlorophyll. So sunlight is absorbed by the chlorophyll pigment molecules within the thylakoids. Now, you need to know the term grana because the stacks of thylakoids are called grana. So in addition to thylakoids, which carry out the light reactions of photosynthesis, we also have the stroma, which is the fluid that surrounds the thylakoids. And this is where the light-independent reactions occur, and they're also called the Calvin cycle reactions. So the thylakoids are where sunlight energy is absorbed by the pigment molecules. And then the stroma is where carbon dioxide is converted into food for the plant. And you can see here, I'll blow it up because this is very small. When we look, it doesn't let me. I forgot. I tried to do this before. Okay. So here's your leaf, and here's a cross section of your leaf. So you have these cells on the top, and then you have these cells on the bottom. And I think they're just called like the epidermis, upper epidermis and lower epidermis. But the tissue in between the top and bottom cells is called mesophyll tissue. And you can see there's 2 rows of cells, and they all have these little green structures in them. So the mesophyll tissue contains the chloroplast. Now you also see on the underside of the leaf the stomata, which are the pores where carbon dioxide enters and oxygen leaves. So within the chloroplast, here are the stacks of thylakoids. A thylakoid is one green disc, and then a stack is called a granum. And then the fluid that surrounds the thylakoid is called the stroma. Chloroplast in motion. I would watch this just because it's just cool to watch. These are your, oh gosh, I can't think. What did I tell you? Eladia. These are your Eladia cells, and this is slide number 14. This is the chemical equation for photosynthesis, and you will notice it is the reverse of cellular respiration. So it's going to be, the reactants are going to be carbon dioxide gas and water, and in the presence of sunlight energy, the products are going to be glucose, oxygen. I don't like that. Okay. It's basically no water is produced because I don't know how to explain it. I'd rather you learn it as carbon dioxide and water form glucose and oxygen, because I think it's a little bit complicated to talk about how there's 12 water molecules in the reactants and only 6 in the products. I just, I don't like that. So there is an electron transport chain that I'm going to talk to you about. Of course, there has to be an electron transport chain again in chapter 10, but it's used in the first part of photosynthesis. Oh, and I can tell you also, photosynthesis is, instead of catabolic, it is and instead of exergonic, photosynthesis is endergonic. It requires energy. It absorbs energy. It does not give off energy. So photosynthesis is endergonic, and instead of catabolic, we say that it is anabolic, because it's taking carbon dioxide, which is a small molecule, and producing glucose, which is a larger molecule. So it's an anabolic reaction, a synthesis reaction. It's also redox. So our reactants are carbon dioxide and water. Water is oxidized because it loses those hydrogens. In other words, it loses electrons and forms oxygen gas. And carbon dioxide is reduced because it gains hydrogen in the form of glucose. It gains hydrogen and electrons in the form of glucose. So you have carbon dioxide is reduced to glucose. Water is oxidized to oxygen. Now, there are 2 parts of photosynthesis. There are the light reactions, which happen in the thylakoids. And the purpose of the light reactions is to absorb sunlight and make 2 molecules, ATP and NADPH. And then the Calvin cycle is the synthesis part, and that occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast. That is when glucose is actually made, produced from carbon dioxide. The light reactions split water. So one thing that's different about the electron transport chain during cellular respiration versus during photosynthesis is that in cellular respiration, it was NADH and FADH2 that provided electrons and protons, or hydrogen ions, for the electron transport chain. But it's going to be water. Water is split, and we know when water's split, it's split into oxygen gas, and it's split into hydrogen ions, and it is split into electrons. So the water is actually going to provide the electrons for the electron transport chain, and it's going to provide the hydrogen ions or protons for chemiosmosis. So another thing is the splitting of water is going to release oxygen. So oxygen is actually produced during the light reactions of photosynthesis. And the other products of the light reactions are NADPH, which will be used in the Calvin cycle reactions, and ATP, which is produced in a process similar to oxidative phosphorylation, but because it uses sunlight, we call it photophosphorylation. So the products of the light reactions are actually NADPH and ATP. They're the 2 products of the light reactions, and they're both used in the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle will use the products of the light reactions, the ATP and the NADPH. Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast, and it's going to make sugar from carbon dioxide, and it will do this using the ATP and NADPH generated during the light reactions. The Calvin cycle is kind of like the citric acid cycle. It's a cycle or a series of reactions, but it starts with carbon fixation. And that means carbon dioxide is incorporated into organic molecules. And here you can see this is inside the chloroplast. You can see the thylakoids here absorbing sunlight energy, splitting water, and producing oxygen gas by splitting water. What you don't see is the hydrogen ions and electrons that are used to produce ATP and NADPH through an electron transport chain. But after the light reactions produce ATP and NADPH, both of those enter the Calvin cycle. They're like the fuel for the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma and converts carbon dioxide into sugar. There's a bioflix on photosynthesis. Again, I'm funny about bioflix, but that's slide 25 if you want to watch it. I mean, there's a lot of detail in the bioflix. Sometimes I find myself having to watch the bioflix like more than once to really understand it. There's some information now on sunlight energy, which is a form of electromagnetic radiation. And electromagnetic radiation travels in waves. So when we talk about a form of energy, a form of electromagnetic radiation, we describe it in terms of the wavelength of these waves. So that's a distance between the crest of those electromagnetic waves. And the longer those wavelengths are, the lower the energy is. And the shorter the wavelengths are, the higher the energy is. So what you're looking at here is the visible light spectrum. And I'm sure you've seen this before. It's all the colors that would show in the rainbow or in a prism. And you probably learned the colors in the visible light spectrum from red all the way down to violet. So you probably even learned a name, Roy G. Biv. That means red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So basically the visible light wavelengths are divided into short wavelengths, which give off more energy, long wavelengths, which give off less energy, but they're divided into different colors. And those colors of visible light, those colors of visible light, you have to understand like why we see green when we look at a plant. That is because not that green light is reflected, not that green light is absorbed, but that green light is reflected. So when we look at something and we see that it's a certain color, like a plant is green, that means it reflects green light, but it absorbs other wavelengths of light. So the green pigments of the plant are going to absorb in the red and the blue violet end of the visible light spectrum. So pigments are substances that absorb visible light from sunlight. Most leaves appear green because chlorophyll reflects green and absorbs violet, blue, and red light. So it reflects green and appears green to us, but it absorbs in the violet blue end and the red end of the spectrum. So here's an animation on light energy and pigments, slide 33. And we do, in biology, we do use a spectrophotometer to measure a pigment's ability to absorb various wavelengths. It basically measures the light transmitted at each wavelength. And then an absorption spectrum is a graph that shows absorption versus wavelength. This is something that we use in biology to analyze different chemicals. You can analyze pigments, you can analyze other substances, but the chlorophyll pigments, there's actually 3 types of pigments in chloroplast, and they are chlorophyll A, which is green, but it's a different shade of green than chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll A is considered the primary pigment, but chlorophyll B is an accessory pigment. The carotenoids are a separate group of accessory pigments. So I am actually going to stop here at slide number 36, and we will start with slide 37 in the next recording.